The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand corridors of Kensington Palace. But inside the private quarters, Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat motionless at her dressing table. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a letter that had arrived in the early hours. The royal seal meant nothing now. This was personal, devastating, and would change everything she thought she knew about her marriage. William had left for an official engagement 3 hours ago, kissing her forehead, in that distant way that had become their routine. She watched him in the mirror now, remembering when that same kiss used to make her heart race. These days, it felt more like a duty than desire. The letter in her hands contained photographs and documents that a trusted friend had risked everything to deliver. The images showed William leaving a private club in London at 2 a.m., not alone. The woman beside him wasn't a royal aide or security detail. Catherine recognized her immediately. Rose Hanbury, the Marchioness of Cholmondeley. Someone they'd both considered a close family friend. The photographs were dated over several months, showing a pattern that Catherine had been trying to ignore. She thought back to the subtle changes in William's behavior over the past year. The late-night phone calls he'd taken his study, the unexplained absences during family time, and the way he'd grown cold whenever she mentioned their future plans. Catherine had convinced herself it was the stress of his royal duties, the weight of knowing he would one day be king. But these photographs told a different story entirely. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from her private secretary, reminding her about the charity luncheon she was supposed to attend in 2 hours. She was expected to smile, shake hands, and give an inspiring speech about family values and supporting one another through difficult times. The irony wasn't lost on her. She walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, where her children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, were playing with their nanny. Their laughter drifted up to her window, innocent and pure. They had no idea that their world might be about to crumble. The thought of explaining this to them, of watching their faces change when they realized their father wasn't the hero they believed him to be, made her stomach turn. Catherine had always prided herself on being strong. Growing up as a commoner, she'd faced constant scrutiny about whether she was good enough for the future king. She'd proven herself time and again, transforming from Kate Middleton, the girl from Berkshire, into Catherine, Princess of Wales, beloved by the British public. She'd weathered scandals, criticism, and the relentless pressure of royal life. But this felt different. This wasn't about her worthiness or public perception. This was about betrayal at its most intimate level. She remembered their wedding day, standing in Westminster Abbey with 2 billion people watching. William had looked into her eyes and promised to love, honor, and cherish her. She'd believed every word. Even during their difficult patches, the 10-year on-and-off relationship before their engagement, the adjustment to royal life, the challenges of raising children in the public eye, she'd never doubted his fundamental loyalty. Now, holding evidence of his infidelity, she felt like she was seeing their entire relationship through new eyes. Had he ever truly chosen her, or had she simply been the safe option, the one who would play the part of dutiful royal wife while he sought passion elsewhere? Catherine set the letter down and walked to her private bathroom, splashing cold water on her face. In the mirror, she saw a woman who looked older than her years, stress lines around her eyes that even the best makeup couldn't completely hide. The public saw her as having the perfect life, married to a prince, living in a palace, with beautiful children and unlimited resources. If only they knew the truth about the loneliness that had been growing inside these palace walls. The separate bedrooms they'd maintained for months, claiming it was due to William's schedule. The family dinners where conversation felt forced and artificial. The way he'd stopped really listening when she spoke, always seeming distracted or elsewhere mentally. She'd tried everything to reconnect with him. Romantic dinners, surprise trips, even suggesting they see a marriage counselor discreetly. William had dismissed every attempt, claiming he was fine and that she was being overly sensitive. Now she understood why he'd been so resistant to working on their relationship. He'd already found someone else to fulfill those needs. The hardest part wasn't even the betrayal itself, but the realization that she'd been living a lie for months. Every public appearance, every interview where she'd spoken about their strong marriage, every time she'd defended him against criticism, it had all been built on deception. Catherine picked up her phone and scrolled through the hundreds of messages from well-wishers, royal watchers, and organizations wanting her support. They all saw her as the embodiment of modern royalty, relatable, down-to-earth, but still magical. They had no idea that behind her perfectly curated Instagram posts and carefully orchestrated public appearances, her marriage was falling apart. She thought about calling her mother, Carol Middleton, who had always been her strongest supporter. But what could she say? How could she explain that the fairy tale marriage everyone celebrated was actually a nightmare? That the man she'd loved for over 15 years had been lying to her face while carrying on an affair with someone they'd invited to their children's birthday parties? The clock on her dresser chimed, reminding her that real life continued despite personal catastrophes. In an hour, she'd have to put on her public face and pretend that everything was perfect. She'd have to smile for photographers, make small talk with dignitaries, and give a speech about supporting families in crisis, all while her own family was secretly in shambles. Catherine walked back to the window and watched her children, playing below. They deserved better than parents who were living separate lives under the same roof. They deserved honesty, stability, and parents who actually loved each other. The question now was whether she could find the strength to fight for her marriage or if it was already too late to save what they'd built together. William returned to Kensington Palace that evening with the weight of guilt pressing down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd spent the day at various royal engagements, shaking hands and making speeches about duty and service, all while knowing he was failing catastrophically in his most important role as a husband and father. The confrontation he'd been dreading for months was waiting for him in their private sitting room. Catherine sat perfectly composed in her favorite armchair, still wearing the elegant dress from her afternoon charity event, but her eyes told a different story. They were red-rimmed and held a steely determination he'd never seen before. The photographs were spread across the coffee table between them like evidence in a courtroom. William's heart sank as he recognized each image, each moment he'd convinced himself was harmless, each lie he'd told himself about what he was doing. There was no denying it now, no way to explain away months of deception. How long? Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through him more sharply than if she'd been screaming. William loosened his tie and sat down across from her, unable to meet her eyes. The words he'd rehearsed in his mind during the drive home suddenly seemed inadequate. How do you explain betraying someone who'd stood by you through everything? Someone who'd given up her privacy, her career, her entire identity to support. Your dreams? It's not what you think, he began, then stopped himself. Even he didn't believe that pathetic excuse. Catherine picked up one of the photographs. Him and Rose walking closely together outside a private restaurant in Chelsea, their body language unmistakably intimate. Then tell me what it is, William. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks exactly like what I think it is. The formal use of his full name hit him like a physical blow. She hadn't called him William in years. It was always Will, even during their worst arguments. The distance in that single word told him more about the damage he'd done than any angry outburst could have. He tried to explain how it had started innocently enough. Rose had been going through her own marital problems with David. She'd reached out to him for advice, and their conversations had gradually become more personal, more frequent. What began as friendly support had slowly evolved into something else. Late-night phone calls that went on for hours, secret meetings where they talked about everything except their respective families. She understood what it was like. William, said, finally looking up at Catherine. "The pressure, the constant scrutiny, the way everyone expects you to be perfect all the time. You make it look so easy, Catherine. You always have. Sometimes I felt like I was drowning, and she was the only one who got it." Catherine's laugh was bitter and hollow. "You think this is easy for me? You think I don't feel that same pressure every single day? The difference is that when I was struggling, I came to you. I tried to talk to you about it. But every time I did, you brushed me off or told me I was being dramatic." She was right, and William knew it. Over the past year, Catherine had made multiple attempts to discuss their relationship, the stress of their roles, and her feelings of isolation. He'd dismissed her concerns, partly because he was dealing with his own problems, and partly because acknowledging her struggles would have meant admitting his own failures as a husband. "I never meant for this to happen," William said, running his hands through his hair. "It just evolved. And then I didn't know how to stop it without destroying everything." Catherine stood up and walked to the window overlooking the garden, where they'd spent so many happy moments as a family. "So instead, you decided to destroy our marriage quietly, piece by piece, while lying to my face every single day." The pain in her voice was unbearable. William had always prided himself on being honorable, on following in the footsteps of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, who had embodied duty and service above personal desires. Yet here he was, having behaved in the most dishonorable way possible. "Children have been asking why Daddy doesn't eat breakfast with us anymore," Catherine continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Charlotte asked me yesterday if you still love us. What was I supposed to tell her? That Daddy has been too busy with his girlfriend to have time for his family?" The mention of their children hit William harder than anything else. He thought about 8-year-old George, who still looked at him like he hung the moon, 5-year-old Charlotte, who wrote him little notes and slipped them under his office door, 3-year-old Louis, who ran to him with pure joy every time he came home. How could he explain to them that he'd been choosing someone else over their family? "I ended it," William said quietly. 3 days ago. I told Rose it was over, that I couldn't continue hurting you and the children." Catherine turned from the window, her eyes flashing with anger. "You ended it because you were caught, not because you suddenly developed a conscience. If those photographs hadn't surfaced, how long would it have continued? Another month? Another year?" William didn't have an answer because he honestly didn't. No. He'd been living in a fantasy world where somehow he could maintain both relationships without anyone getting hurt. The reality was that he'd been a coward, too afraid to face his problems head-on and too selfish to consider the consequences of his actions. "I need to know everything," Catherine said, sitting back down. "Every detail, every lie you told me, every time you chose her over us. I can't make any decisions about our future until I understand exactly what I'm dealing with." For the next 2 hours, William confessed everything. The business trips that had been covers for romantic getaways, the family dinners he'd missed for secret dates, the times he'd lied about working late when he was actually with Rose. Each revelation felt like a knife twisting in Catherine's heart, but she sat there stoically, absorbing every painful detail. The worst part wasn't the physical betrayal, though that was devastating enough. It was learning about the emotional intimacy he'd shared with another woman, the dreams, fears, and vulnerabilities he'd kept from his own wife, while sharing them freely with someone else. Catherine realized that somewhere along the way, she'd become a stranger to the man she'd loved for most of her adult life. "I don't know if I can forgive this," Catherine said when William finally finished his confession. "I don't know if I should even try." William nodded, understanding that he had no right to ask for forgiveness, let alone expect it. He'd broken the most sacred trust between them, and the consequences were entirely his to bear. "What happens now?" he asked. Catherine looked around the room that had been their sanctuary, filled with photos of their family and memories of happier times. Now we have to decide whether our marriage is worth saving or if we're just prolonging the inevitable. But William, if there's any chance of working through this, you have to be completely honest with me from this point forward. No more lies, no more secrets, no more choosing other people over our family. William promised that he would, though they both knew that trust, once broken, was incredibly difficult to rebuild. As they sat in the growing darkness of their sitting room, both of them wondered if love alone was enough to overcome the damage that had been done to their marriage and their family. 3 weeks had passed since the devastating confrontation, and the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace felt like walking through a minefield. Catherine moved through her daily routines with mechanical precision, attending engagements, caring for the children, and maintaining the public facade that everything was perfectly normal in the Wales household. But behind closed doors, she was falling apart. The sleepless nights were the worst part. Catherine would lie awake staring at the ceiling of the guest room she'd moved into, her mind replaying every moment of her marriage, searching for signs she'd missed. Had William been unhappy for years? Had she failed him somehow as a wife? The questions tortured her, spinning endlessly without resolution. Her mother, Carol Middleton, had been visiting daily under the pretense of helping with the children. Catherine hadn't told her the complete truth, but mothers have an intuition about their children's pain. Carol could see the weight her daughter was carrying, even if she didn't understand its source. "You're losing weight," Carol observed one morning as they sat in Catherine's private breakfast room, watching the children play in the garden. "And these dark circles under your eyes. When was the last time you had a proper night's sleep?" Catherine stirred her untouched tea, unable to meet her mother's concerned gaze. "I'm fine, Mum. Just tired from all the engagements lately." "Catherine Elizabeth Middleton," Carol said, using her daughter's full maiden name the way she had when Catherine was a child in trouble. "I've known you for 41 years. You are not fine." The use of her maiden name hit Catherine unexpectedly hard, reminding her of who she'd been before William, before the titles and the palaces and the golden prison of royal life. Sometimes she wondered if that girl from Berkshire would have been strong enough to walk away from this marriage instead of clinging to the hope that it could be saved. Meanwhile, William was struggling with his own demons. The guilt was consuming him from the inside out, made worse by Catherine's polite distance. She spoke to him only when necessary, maintained perfect courtesy in front of the children and staff, but the warmth that had always existed between them was completely gone. He'd thrown himself into work with desperate intensity, accepting every engagement, every charity commitment, every official duty that would keep him busy and away from the uncomfortable reality at home. But no amount of ribbon cuttings or hospital visits could quiet the voice in his head, telling him he'd destroyed the most important thing in his life. The children were beginning to notice the tension. Prince George, at 8 years old, was particularly observant. He'd started asking pointed questions about why Mommy and Daddy didn't sit together during family movie nights anymore, and why Daddy was always working when they asked him to play. Princess Charlotte, with the emotional intelligence that seemed to run in the Spencer side of the family, had become clingy and anxious. She'd started having nightmares and would often end up in Catherine's bed in the early hours of the morning, seeking comfort from the parent who was still consistently present and attentive. Even 3-year-old Louis seemed to sense something was wrong. The typically cheerful toddler had become more demanding and prone to tantrums, acting out in ways that were completely unlike his usual sunny disposition. Catherine felt the additional pressure of protecting her children from the adult, problems that threatened to upend their world. She maintained their routines religiously, made sure they still felt loved and secure, and worked overtime to compensate for William's emotional absence. But the strain was showing, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the children's world would have to be addressed directly. The breaking point came during a private dinner party they'd committed to hosting months earlier. Several close friends and royal family members were expected, including some who had no idea about the crisis brewing in the Wales marriage. Catherine dressed carefully for the evening, choosing a stunning navy dress that had always been one of William's favorites. She told herself it wasn't for him. She was dressing for herself, to feel confident and in control. But as she looked in the mirror, she wondered if some part of her was still hoping to see a flicker of the man who used. To look at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. The dinner was a masterclass in royal training. Both Catherine and William played their parts perfectly, the devoted couple, finishing each other's sentences, sharing private jokes, touching each other's arms in the casual way that long-married couples do. Their guests had no idea they were watching an elaborate performance. But the strain of pretending for 3 hours straight took its toll. As soon as the last guest left, Catherine excused herself and went upstairs, finally allowing the mask to slip. William found her 20 minutes later in their former shared bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed they'd once shared, crying quietly. "Catherine," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep pretending that everything is normal when it's not. I can't keep acting like the perfect royal wife when my marriage is falling apart." William sat down beside her, careful to maintain some distance. "What do you want me to do? How can I fix this?" Catherine looked at him with eyes full of pain and exhaustion. "I don't know if you can, William. I don't know if anyone can. 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew who you were, who we were together. Now I feel like I'm living with a stranger." She told him about the nights she'd spent going through their photo albums, looking for signs of when things started to go wrong, about the way she'd started questioning every memory, every happy moment, wondering if it had been real or if he'd been thinking about someone else even then. "I used to be so proud of us," Catherine continued. "Proud of how we'd built something real despite all the pressure and scrutiny. I thought we were different from the other royal marriages that ended in disaster. I thought what we had was stronger." William wanted to reach for her, to comfort her, but he knew he'd lost the right to be her source of comfort when he'd become the source of her pain. "I know I've destroyed your trust," he said. "I know I've hurt you in ways that might be unforgivable. But Catherine, I need you to know that everything we built together, every happy moment, every laugh, every quiet evening at home with the children, all of that was real. My feelings for you were never fake, even when I was making the worst decisions of my life." Catherine stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the palace gardens. In the distance, she could see the lights of London, millions of people living their normal lives, unaware that the fairy tale marriage they'd celebrated was crumbling behind these ancient walls. "The problem is, William, I don't know how to separate the real from the fake anymore, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to try." For the first time since the affair had been exposed, William truly understood the full scope of what he'd done. He hadn't just betrayed his wife. He'd shattered her entire sense of reality, her trust in her own judgment, her belief in their shared history. The woman who had stood by him through everything now questioned the very foundation of their relationship. As Catherine continued to stare out at the night sky, both of them realized they were at a crossroads. The next decisions they made would determine not just the future of their marriage, but the lives of their 3 children and the very future of the monarchy itself. The private crisis that had been brewing behind palace walls for weeks was about to become very public. Catherine received the call from her private secretary at 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. A major British tabloid had gotten hold of the photographs and was planning to run the story in their Wednesday edition. "They're giving us until noon to provide a statement," her secretary explained in a tense voice. "Ma'am, they have everything. The photos, witness accounts, and they're calling it the biggest royal scandal since—" Catherine didn't need her to finish the sentence. "Since Charles and Diana." The comparison made her feel physically sick. William was already on a plane to Scotland for what was supposed to be a 2-day tour of sustainable farming initiatives. Catherine's first instinct was to call him immediately, but she stopped herself. This crisis was his doing. Let him face it head-on instead of relying on her to manage the damage as she'd done so many times before. Instead, she called an emergency meeting with the palace's senior communications team. Within an hour, Kensington Palace's crisis management protocol was in full swing. The same PR machine that had protected the royal family through countless scandals was now working to contain the explosive story of William's affair. But Catherine knew that no amount of carefully crafted press releases could protect her children from what was coming. George and Charlotte were old enough to hear playground whispers, to see newspaper headlines, to understand that something terrible was being said about their father. She made the difficult decision to pull them out of school for the rest of the week, telling their teachers only that there was a family situation that required privacy. The innocent questions from her children broke her heart. "Why can't we go to school, Mama?" Charlotte asked as they sat together in the palace nursery, surrounded by toys that couldn't distract from the adult chaos swirling around them. "Sometimes, grown-ups need to handle important matters privately," Catherine explained, choosing her words carefully. "You'll be back to school soon, darling." But George, with the perceptiveness that worried Catherine more each day, wasn't satisfied with vague explanations. "Is it because of the mean things people write about our family sometimes? Are they writing mean things about Papa?" Catherine's heart shattered a little more. Her 8-year-old son was already learning to associate public attention with pain and scandal. This wasn't the childhood she'd wanted for any of her children. When William finally returned from Scotland that evening, he looked like a man who'd aged years in a single day. The press had ambushed him at every stop of his tour, shouting questions about his marriage and demanding responses to allegations they wouldn't even specify publicly yet. "They know," he said as soon as he walked into Catherine's sitting room. "The whole story is coming out tomorrow." Catherine looked up from the children's book she'd been pretending to read. "I know. We have 12 hours to decide how we're going to handle this." The palace communications team had prepared several options. They could deny everything and claim the photos were misleading or taken out of context. They could admit to marital difficulties without confirming specific details. Or they could take control of the narrative by releasing their own statement before the tabloid story hit the stands. "What do you want to do?" William asked, sitting across from her in the chair where they'd had their first honest conversation about his affair weeks earlier. Catherine set down the book and looked at him directly. "What I want is for none of this to have happened. What I want is for my children to be able to go to school without having their classmates repeat gossip about their father's love life. What I want is to not have to explain to my mother why photographers are camping outside her house in Berkshire." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But since we can't have what we want, we need to focus on damage control. Not for us, William. For George, Charlotte, and Louis. They deserve better than having their childhood overshadowed by this scandal." The next 24 hours were the longest of Catherine's life. The story broke at midnight online, spreading across social media like wildfire. By morning, it was front-page news not just in Britain but around the world. Television news programs led with the story, royal commentators were brought in to analyze every detail, and the palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from reporters seeking additional comment. The headlines were brutal. "Future King's Secret Affair Rocks Royal Marriage." Kate's heartbreak as William's betrayal exposed. Is this the end of the Wales fairy tale? Catherine made the painful decision to look at some of the coverage, knowing she needed to understand how the story was being portrayed. The photos of William and Rose were everywhere, analyzed and dissected by body language experts and royal watchers. Some outlets were sympathetic to Catherine, portraying her as the wronged wife. Others speculated about whether the marriage had been in trouble for years. The most devastating coverage focused on the children. Paparazzi photos from months earlier were being republished with new context. Images of family outings where William looked distracted or disengaged were now presented as evidence of his emotional distance from his family. Catherine's phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from friends, family members, and well-wishers. Many she ignored, but one made her pause. A text from Harry, William's younger brother, who, despite their complicated relationship in recent years, simply said, "Catherine, I'm so sorry. The children don't deserve this. Neither do you." The message brought tears to her eyes because it represented something she'd lost in all of this. The extended family relationships that had once brought her comfort and support. Harry and Meghan's departure from royal life meant the children had fewer cousins to play with, fewer family gatherings to look forward to. Now, with her own marriage in crisis, that sense of family was further fractured. By afternoon, the palace gates were surrounded by reporters and photographers. Catherine couldn't even take the children to the garden without risking intrusive photos being taken with long-range lenses. They were effectively prisoners in their own home, trapped by the consequences of William's choices. The breaking point came when 5-year-old Charlotte found Catherine crying in her dressing room while watching news coverage on her phone. The little girl climbed into her mother's lap with the intuitive comfort that children possess. "Mama, why are you sad?" Charlotte asked, her small hand touching Catherine's wet cheek. Catherine realized in that moment that her children were going to find out the truth whether she told them or not. The playground gossip, the overheard conversations, the changed behavior of adults around them. Eventually, they would piece together that their father had done something that hurt their mother deeply. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt the people they love," Catherine said carefully, holding her daughter close. "Papa made a mistake that hurt Mama's feelings, and now everyone is talking about it." Charlotte considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important revelations. "Did Papa say he was sorry?" "Yes, darling. Papa is very sorry." "And do you forgive him?" The question hit Catherine like a physical blow because she still didn't have an answer. She'd been asking herself the same thing for weeks, torn between the love she still felt for the man she'd married and the pain of his betrayal. "I'm still thinking about it," Catherine told her daughter honestly. "Sometimes when someone hurts us very badly, it takes time to decide if we can forgive them." As Charlotte snuggled closer, Catherine made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of trying to weather this storm in silence, instead of protecting William from the full consequences of his actions, she was going to take control of her own narrative. The next morning, she would do something unprecedented for a senior royal facing personal crisis. She would give her own interview, tell her own version of events, and make it clear that she would not be a silent victim in her own story. The decision to give her first solo interview since the scandal broke was met with shock and resistance from the palace establishment. Senior courtiers, communications experts, and even some members of the royal family tried to dissuade Catherine from speaking publicly about her private pain. But for the first time in months, she felt completely certain about her choice. "The story is already out there," she told the emergency palace meeting convened to discuss her decision. "People are speculating, making assumptions, and creating narratives about my life and my children's lives. I refuse to let others control my story anymore." Catherine chose to sit down with Sarah Mitchell, a respected BBC journalist known for her thoughtful interviews rather than sensationalist reporting. The interview would take place in Catherine's private sitting room at Kensington Palace, the same space where she'd confronted William about his affair weeks earlier. On the morning of the interview, Catherine dressed carefully in a simple navy blouse and blazer, professional but approachable, strong but not harsh. She'd barely slept the night before, running through potential questions and rehearsing answers that balanced honesty with dignity. William had tried to talk her out of the interview until the very last minute. "Catherine, please reconsider this." Once you say these things publicly, we can't take them back. Think about what this might mean for our marriage, for the children's future." Catherine looked at him with a calmness that surprised them both. "I have thought about it, William. I've thought about little else for days. Our marriage was damaged the moment you chose to betray our vows. The children's future was affected the moment those photographs were taken. I'm not creating this crisis. I'm dealing with the one you created." The interview itself was unlike anything the British public had ever seen from a senior royal family member. Sarah Mitchell began gently, asking about Catherine's role as Princess of Wales and her charitable work, allowing her to settle into the conversation before moving to more difficult territory. "There have been some very challenging personal revelations in recent weeks," Sarah said carefully. "How are you and your family coping with this level of public scrutiny around private matters?" Catherine took a breath, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "It's been incredibly difficult, especially for our children. George, Charlotte, and Louis didn't choose public life in the same way William and I did. They're just children who deserve to feel safe and loved, regardless of what mistakes their parents have made." The use of the word mistakes sent shockwaves through social media within minutes of the interview airing. This was as close as any royal had ever come to publicly acknowledging infidelity within their marriage. "When private matters become public in this way, it forces you to confront truths that perhaps you weren't ready to face," Catherine continued. "As a wife and mother, my first priority is always the well-being of my children. As a woman, I refuse to be defined solely by someone else's choices." Sarah pressed gently further. "Are you and Prince William working together to address these challenges?" Catherine paused, choosing her words carefully. "Marriage is complicated under any circumstances. Royal marriage, with its public pressures and expectations, adds additional layers of complexity. When trust is broken, it takes enormous work from both people to rebuild it, if rebuilding is even possible." The conditional phrase, "if rebuilding is even possible," dominated news headlines within hours. Royal commentators debated whether Catherine was signaling the end of her marriage or simply acknowledging the difficulty of their situation. But perhaps the most powerful moment of the interview came when Sarah asked about the children's understanding of the situation. "Charlotte asked me recently whether I forgive her father," Catherine said, her voice becoming slightly emotional for the first time. "I realize that my children are watching how I handle this crisis, and they're learning from my example about how to respond when someone you love hurts you deeply. I want to teach them that forgiveness is possible, but it must be earned. I want them to understand that love doesn't mean accepting behavior that damages your sense of self-worth." Catherine went on to speak about the loneliness of royal life, the pressure to maintain perfection, and the importance of having honest conversations about mental health and emotional well-being. She talked about her work with various charities supporting families in crisis, noting the irony that she was now experiencing firsthand many of the challenges she'd been trying to help others navigate. "I've learned that strength isn't about pretending everything is perfect," she said. "Real strength comes from facing difficult truths, making hard choices, and prioritizing your values even when it's uncomfortable." The interview concluded with Sarah asking about Catherine's future plans. "I'm taking things one day at a time," Catherine replied. "My children need stability and honesty from at least one of their parents. My charitable work continues to give me purpose and meaning. And I'm learning that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is admit that you don't have all the answers yet." The response to the interview was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with support for Catherine's courage and honesty. The hashtag #StandWithCatherine began trending worldwide within an hour of the broadcast. Women from all walks of life shared their own stories of betrayal and recovery, praising Catherine for speaking openly about the reality of broken trust in marriage. Public opinion polls showed a dramatic shift in how the crisis was being perceived. Before the interview, many had viewed it as a private matter that should be handled behind closed doors. After Catherine's honest and dignified responses, the public overwhelmingly supported her right to control her own narrative. More importantly, the interview seemed to give Catherine a sense of agency she'd been missing for months. By speaking her truth publicly, she'd reclaimed some of the power that had been taken from her when William's affair was exposed. She was no longer just the victim of someone else's scandal. She was a woman making conscious choices about her future. The palace establishment was less pleased with the public response. Senior courtiers worried about the precedent Catherine had set by discussing private family matters so openly. There were concerns about how this might affect the monarchy's traditional approach to scandal management, which relied heavily on silence and the hope that public attention would eventually move on to other stories. William's reaction was complex. Part of him was proud of Catherine's strength and eloquence during the interview. She'd been poised, thoughtful, and had managed to discuss their crisis without being vindictive or cruel toward him personally. But he was also terrified about what her newfound independence might mean for their marriage. The interview had made one thing crystal clear. Catherine was no longer willing to sacrifice her own well-being for the sake of appearances or tradition. She'd found her voice in the midst of crisis, and there was no going back to the silent suffering that had characterized the weeks immediately following his betrayal. That evening, as Catherine tucked the children into bed, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of peace with her own choices. Whatever happened next with her marriage, she knew she'd handled this crisis with dignity and strength. She'd shown her children that it was possible to face difficult truths without losing yourself in the process. George, perceptive as always, seemed to understand that something significant had shifted in their family dynamic. "Mama, you seem different today," he observed as she kissed him goodnight. "Different how, darling?" "Stronger," he said simply. "Like you're not sad anymore, just strong." Catherine realized that her 8-year-old son had identified exactly what she'd been struggling to understand about herself. She wasn't happy. The pain of William's betrayal was still very real, but she was no longer powerless. The interview had been her declaration of independence, her statement that she would not be defined by her husband's failures or constrained by others' expectations of how she should respond to crisis. As she finally fell asleep that night, Catherine knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. The public attention would continue. William would have to decide how to respond to her very public stance, and they would both have to navigate the complex process of either rebuilding their marriage or ending it with dignity. But for the first time since discovering the affair, Catherine felt like she was in control of her own destiny rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond her control. 6 months after the scandal first broke, Catherine stood in the same garden where her children had played innocently on the morning she'd discovered William's affair. But everything had changed, not just in her marriage, but in herself. Thus, months following her groundbreaking interview had been a whirlwind of difficult decisions, painful conversations, and ultimately unexpected growth. The public support she'd received had given her strength she didn't know she possessed, but more importantly, it had shown her children that she could face adversity with grace and dignity. William had responded to her interview with his own carefully crafted statement, acknowledging his serious errors in judgment and asking for privacy as they worked through their personal challenges. But Catherine could see that the dynamic between them had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer the accommodating wife who absorbed his moods and made excuses for his behavior. She had found her voice, and she wasn't afraid to use it. The decision to enter marriage counseling had been Catherine's, presented to William as a non-negotiable requirement if he wanted any chance of salvaging their relationship. Dr. Margaret Reynolds, a discreet therapist who specialized in high-profile couples, had been seeing them twice weekly in a private office away from palace grounds. The sessions had been brutal in their honesty. Catherine had finally been able to express years of accumulated resentment. Not just about the affair, but about the way William had gradually withdrawn from their emotional intimacy, leaving her to manage their family's needs largely alone. William, for his part, had been forced to confront his own selfishness and the entitled attitude that had allowed him to justify his betrayal. "I think I convinced myself that because royal life was difficult for me, I deserved some kind of escape or relief," William had admitted during one particularly intense session. "I never stopped to consider that it was just as difficult for you, but you were handling it without betraying our marriage vows." Dr. Reynolds had helped them understand that the affair was a symptom of deeper problems in their relationship: communication issues, unmet emotional needs, and the pressure of living their entire lives in the public eye. But she'd also been clear that understanding the causes didn't excuse the betrayal or guarantee that the marriage could be saved. The children had been their primary concern throughout the healing process. George and Charlotte had both needed counseling to help them process the public nature of their family's crisis. Charlotte, in particular, had struggled with anxiety and had difficulty trusting that her parents would stay together. "Will you and Papa get divorced like Uncle Harry and Aunt Megan moved away?" she'd asked Catherine one evening, the innocent question cutting straight to the heart of everyone's fears. Catherine had been honest within age-appropriate limits. "Papa and I are working very hard to fix the problems in our marriage, but whether we stay together or not, you will always be loved and cared for by both of us." The most significant change had been in Catherine herself. The woman who had once worried constantly about public perception and royal protocol had been replaced by someone who prioritized authenticity and personal values above external expectations. She'd increased her charitable work, focusing particularly on organizations that supported women and families in crisis. Her public appearances had a new energy and purpose that royal watchers and the public alike had noticed and appreciated. William had also undergone his own transformation, though it had been a more painful process. Seeing Catherine's newfound strength and independence had forced him to confront how much he'd taken her support and loyalty for granted. He'd had to rebuild not just her trust, but also his relationship with their children, who had been confused and hurt by the tension in their home. The turning point had come during a family vacation to Balmoral, away from the pressures of London and official duties. For the first time in months, they'd had unstructured time together as a family. William had made a concentrated effort to be present, really present, with the children and Catherine. One evening, as they sat by the fire after putting the children to bed, Catherine had finally been able to articulate what she needed from William if their marriage was going to survive. "I need to feel like I'm your partner, not just your supporting cast member," she'd said. "I need to know that when you're struggling, you'll come to me instead of looking elsewhere for comfort. And I need to believe that you choose me and our family every single day, not because it's your duty, but because it's what you genuinely want." William had taken her hands, looking directly into her eyes. "I want to be the husband you deserve, Catherine. I want to be the father our children can be proud of. I know I've broken your trust, but if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of our lives proving that I deserve another chance." It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. Catherine still had days when the pain of his betrayal felt fresh and overwhelming. William still struggled with the guilt of what he'd done and the fear that he might lose his family permanently. But they were both committed to doing the hard work of rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. The public had watched their journey with fascination and, largely, approval. Catherine's courage in speaking out had changed public expectations about how royal family members should handle personal crises. The old model of silent suffering and stiff upper lips was being replaced by a more human approach that acknowledged real emotions and real struggles. As Catherine tucked Charlotte into bed that night, her daughter looked up at her with the serious expression that had become more common since their family crisis. "Mama, Are you and Papa happy now? Catherine considered the question carefully. We're working on being happy together again, darling. It takes time to fix things that are broken, but we're both trying very hard. Good, Charlotte said simply. I like it better when you smile real smiles instead of pretend ones. Later that evening, as Catherine and William sat together in their private sitting room, the same room where their marriage had nearly ended, they talked about their future with an honesty that had been missing for years. I know we're not the same people we were when we got married, Catherine said. But maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe we can build something stronger from what we've learned. William nodded, understanding that their marriage had been forever changed by the crisis they'd endured. The naive trust of their early years was gone, replaced by something more complex but potentially more resilient. A partnership built on choice rather than assumption, on daily commitment rather than taken-for-granted loyalty. They still had work to do, trust to continue rebuilding, and the ongoing challenge of raising their children in the public eye while maintaining their own authenticity. But as they sat together in comfortable silence, both of them felt something they hadn't experienced in months, hope for their future together. The fairy tale might have been shattered, but in its place, they were building something real.